The Dauphin and the Dauphine cower in a small chamber of La Muette Palace, anxiously awaiting the news of the Dauphin's grandfather, King Louis XV. The king was lying in his bed in the great palace of Versailles, ridden with smallpox. The court already knows his chances of survival at this stage are none. The Dauphin had settled that he would depart with the royal family the moment the king would breathe his last sigh. But on such an occasion, decency forbade that positive orders for the departure should be passed from mouth to mouth. The heads of the stables therefore agreed with the people who were in the king's room that the latter should place a lighted taper near a window, and that at the instance of the king's decease one of them should extinguish it. The taper was extinguished. On this signal, the bodyguards, pages and equerries mounted on horseback, and all was ready for setting off. A dreadful noise, absolutely like thunder, was heard in the outer apartment. It was a crowd of courtiers who were deserting their sovereign, the antechamber, to come to do homage to their new power, Louis XVI. This extraordinary tumult informed the royal couple that they were called the throne. Both, pouring a flood of tears, fell to their knees and exclaimed, "O God, guide us, protect us, for we are too young to reign." When talking about the French intervention in the American Revolution, it is important to point out that it was essential for American success. Without both direct and indirect support from France, America would have stood no chance of becoming an independent country. Over the course of the war, France contributed 50 to 70 million livres, or 0.75 to 1.05 billion US dollars in today's money, to the American war effort, keeping the American Continental Army alive. Her Spanish ally contributed 10 to 20 million livres via indirect aid. Without help, America would have had militias to rebel against her colonial overlord. However, without a regularly paid Continental Army, independence would have been snuffed out. Even with all the help America received, the fight was still reasonably close. France ended up paying 1.3 billion livres for the war in total, triggering a crisis that the monarchy itself as an institution would fall victim to. In popular history, Benjamin Franklin is often credited for convincing the French into the war. This, however, couldn't be further from the truth. The decisions that brought France into the war were made long before Franklin even reached Paris. To a contemporary observer of the events in 1775 and the ascension of the young king, such a turn of events, however, seemed extremely unlikely. Louis XVI, unlike his grandfather, a meek and unmartial character, was not the likeliest of figures to be known to start such an apocalyptic war. He was a well-meaning and tender-hearted man, yet he lacked the knowledge or experience to form his own opinion on important matters yet. He inherited the crown of the most populous country in Europe, and the only one with both a significant army and navy. Though large and powerful, the country's ancient laws and customs forbade it from having a uniform taxation and governance system. The entrenched interests of the country's elites would make reform difficult, yet not impossible. One area in which the young king's reign promised to be less difficult was diplomacy. 9 days after his ascension, a report on the diplomatic situation trickled in. It read, "Sire, I believe it is my duty to place under the eyes of your majesty the state of the foreign affairs of your kingdom and its relation to foreign powers. It will be seen that they find themselves in a fortunate calm. No disagreement, in fact, menaces its tranquility, and neither the dignity of the crown nor the interest of the people have any blows to carry or to fear. Some disputes, however, stemming from the last war remained with France's neighbor across the Channel. Between 1754 and 1763, France and England had been fighting a brutal war for world domination. In the year 1759, the year of wonders for Britain and the year of horror for France, Britain won domination over North America in the Battle of Quebec, domination over the seas at the Battle of Quiberon Bay, and crushed France's influence in Germany at the Battle of Minden. About this year, a video on this channel will be released in the future, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 ended the war. France was stripped of her North American empire, and her status as the guarantor of small nations in Europe had been greatly diminished. By the time Louis XVI became king, however, reconquering the lost North American French Empire was no longer a foreign policy goal of France. His colonies were sparsely populated and hard to defend, which made them economically unviable. Nevertheless, sources of dispute between Britain and France remained. The treaty stipulated that an English commissioner be stationed at Dunkirk to prevent its fortification, a great blow to French prestige. In the 1763 treaty, France had retained herself access to part of the Newfoundland fisheries, a vital source for trained sailors for the French Navy, without which the French Navy could not have been rebuilt after the 1759 debacle. Nevertheless, harassment of French sailors by British patrols remained a strain on the Franco-British relations. Disputes in India also still presented a threat to the lasting peace. Yet to the contemporary observer of the ascendance of King Louis XVI in 1775, a war was still unlikely. The young king was no friend of war, and the primary weapon for any such potential war against Great Britain, the navy, was in great disrepair. Great sums had been spent after the last war to rebuild the navy. In the 1760s, First Minister Choiseul pursued a strictly anti-British policy and even sent spies to Britain's North American colonies to report on discontent with British rule. From October 1761 he became Naval Minister too, and for 9 years presided over a complete rebuilding of the navy. He managed to build a series of new ships, fill the dockyards with material, and reform the naval administration. In 1770, a crisis between Spain and Britain erupted over the Falkland Islands, which threatened to escalate into open warfare. Choiseul saw this as the culmination of his efforts to start another war with Britain and to end her hegemony. Louis XV, after much of his reign had been dominated by disastrous wars, wanted peace and was angry to discover that. Choiseul was promptly removed from power and his beloved navy fell into disrepair. His successor as naval minister, Boynes, had sowed chaos in the navy by implementing nonsensical reforms. He tried to organize the navy into brigades like the army, with their own internal promotion system and their own stores. This made the navy unmanageable, as fitting out squadrons for missions was near impossible. Officers also had to no longer be trained aboard ships but in naval academies, further alienating the officer corps by disregarding naval tradition. In addition to this organizational disarray, the Navy's material capabilities were also diminished due to a distinct lack of funds. By the time Louis XVI was crowned, the Navy had 64 ships of the line, with 34 being ready for immediate service on paper. It is likely, however, that not even this number could have been fitted out immediately, as naval stores acquired by Choiseul had already dried up. The British Royal Navy, on the contrary, according to intelligence by the French General Garnier, had 145 ships of the line, with 74 being in condition for immediate service. Louis XVI chose Antoine de Sartine, former police chief of Paris, as successor to the terrible minister Boynes, who would go on to become one of the best French naval ministers in history. Louis had had a childhood interest in geography and thus took special interest in the navy. Sartine was not only a meticulous administrator but took great care in maintaining the health of his crews. He and his brilliant right-hand man de Fleuriot went on to reverse most of Boynes' insane reforms and reintroduce the old naval administration. The only aspect of Boynes' reforms kept was the dedicated professional Marine Corps, although it was reduced to 100 companies from the previous 144. Sartine's most pressing concern was to alleviate the shortage of money. By the time he took over, the Navy was even unable to perform regular patrols. There was no major naval presence in the West Indies, where the lucrative sugar-producing colonies depended for the Navy on defense. There was also no naval presence on the islands of Saint-Pierre-aux-Miquelons, the two islands supporting the Newfoundland fisheries, which employed 10,000 fishermen and 250 vessels. Without them, the Navy could not hope to crew most of its ships during times of war. Sartine had no further political agenda other than bureaucratic empire building. He proposed a restructuring of the navy and a new building program to achieve it. He envisioned a navy consisting of 8 80-gun ships of the line, 24 74 gunners, 24 64s, and 8 50-gunners. His plan had apparently more concern for symmetry than for practicality, as 64 and especially 50-gunners were of questionable use in the battle line, and his plan completely disregarded the building of first and second-rate 3-deckers. He requested 13.5 million livres, 4 million above the normal naval budget, to be appropriated to his department in 1775. This was a tall order, as France had a lot of other priorities at the time. There were also other fronts in Europe that could potentially require French attention. For now, however, the situation at France's eastern border too seemed stable, as both German powers, Prussia and Austria, were ruled by elderly, war-weary monarchs. Despite this, the Austrian successor to the throne, the young, hot-headed, glory-seeking Enlightenment thinker Joseph, presented a major danger to European stability should he finally be able to take his throne from his aging mother Maria Theresia. His ambition and designs on Bavaria would have undoubtedly put the last nail into the coffin of the feeble Austro-French alliance. With this potential threat looming, a war with Great Britain seemed even more unlikely. So how come that just 2 years after the ascension of this fine-spirited and well-meaning young king, the monarchy ended up in this catastrophic war? To understand the decision-making at Versailles, one must understand the characters who made them and the motivations they had. Louis did not officially appoint a first minister, yet he was too inexperienced, young, and unconfrontational to make independent decisions. He relied on most political and psychological support from Jean-Frédéric Philippeux, Count de Maurepas. He was a member of the Council of State, France's governing body. His proximity to the king made him the de facto prime minister, despite not holding any official position above his fellow ministers. He was at this point 73 years old and had little interest in risking his own position by starting a war. Another influential minister at court was the intelligent and hard-working Anne-Robert Jacques Turgot. He was appointed naval minister for 6 weeks after being appointed Controller General of Finances, as this field required more attention. With the king's backing, he quickly started a program for the regeneration of the state and monarchy. By his character and fate, Turgot was not a bureaucrat but a tragic hero. Both his personal philosophy and his political program were opposed to war. His last political act was his hopeless fight against the French intervention. Another important political figure at court was Charles Gavier, Comte de Vergennes, Minister of State and Foreign Minister. He was raised from childhood in the diplomatic corps and served as ambassador to both the Ottoman Empire and Sweden. For Vergennes, the function of diplomacy was to maintain the security of the possessions of his monarch, which depended on the maintenance of peace in Europe, which in turn depended on the balance of power. Vergennes' idol was Cardinal de Fleury, foreign minister during his childhood, who presided over a long period of peace and stability in Europe. The cardinal achieved this by seeking the cooperation of Britain, which had brought France a period of great security. Other powers in Europe lacked the financial means to fight big wars on their own, and this was also true for the time of the young king. Only through subsidies from Britain and France other powers were able to wage war on the extent they did in the 7 Years' War. If Britain's friendship and cooperation could be secured, both powers could act as guarantors of a status quo in Europe and prevent any major wars. Vergennes was a man of peace at a time of tranquility, and ironically it was him who was primarily responsible for bringing France into the American War. Just 2 months before the coronation of the young king, grievances between Britain and her American colonies had escalated into open violence. Sartine too urged Vergennes to keep up the spy network and wrote a letter to the commandant of Brest alluding to the possibility of a 1756-style British attack, should the conciliatory North government fall and be replaced by the bellicose Pitt. France's initial reaction to the outbreak of the crisis was strong enough to guarantee a minimum preparedness in case of an attack, but not strong enough to provoke a deterioration of relations. 3 frigates, 3 corvettes and 6 battalions of additional troops were sent to Martinique. No further rearmament occurred. The first proposal for violating France's just and precise conduct towards Britain came from the ambassador to Britain, Boynes. On the 7th of August, he suggested to Vergennes sending the agent Achat de Bonvouloir to make contacts with the Americans. On the very same day, Louis sent a letter to his uncle, Charles III of Spain, stating, "Perhaps there has never been an occasion when the likelihood of a war with England seemed less probable." Vergennes approved of Bonvouloir's mission under 3 conditions. Special attention shall be given to the utmost secrecy. Furthermore, Bonvouloir should prepare a report on the general mood of the colonists and assure them of France's goodwill. Bonvouloir left France in September and met with a secret committee of the Continental Congress in December. As this secret diplomacy, unapproved by the king, was proceeding, Britain went on to hire 18,000 German troops from Hesse and Brunswick to fight in America in January. Later that month, Ambassador Boynes was recalled to Versailles and presented Bonvouloir's report to Vergennes. At the secret December meeting, the colonists had requested French engineers to join the American army and the right to trade for arms and supplies in French ports. Vergennes promptly ordered a memoir written by the playwright and propagandist Caron de Beauchamp advocating for the king to accept the American demands and forwarded it to the king 2 days later. Vergennes meanwhile prepared a similar memoir labeled The Considerations. This was sent to a special committee of the Council of State meant to advise the king, consisting of Maurepas, Vergennes, Sartine, Turgot, and the Comte de Saint-Germain, France's army minister. The only one with the political acumen and motivation to resist Vergennes' agenda was Turgot. He had just won his biggest political victory, making the king issue 6 edicts abolishing the corvée, a forced labor system for the construction of roads, and abolishing guilds in Paris and other cities, as well as guaranteeing freedom of trade. His program was thus diametrically contrary to Vergennes' agenda of escalating with Britain. A comprehensive tax reform was next on Turgot's agenda, however his 6 edicts alone had already made him loads of enemies. This also made him vulnerable to attacks from within the court. Maurepas was already jealous of Turgot's successful reforms, outshining him and threatening his position as the king's most influential advisor. Thus he opportunistically allied himself with Vergennes in undermining him. The memoir did not argue for a direct attack on Britain, but hinted at the potential dangers should the war end prematurely, with mobilized British armies and fleets bearing down on the unprepared Bourbon empires of France and Spain. The document argued for actively prolonging the war by aiding the Americans. The question remains to this day whether these concerns were genuine or if they were just an excuse to push a completely different agenda. Evidence overwhelmingly suggests the latter. Garnier, back in London, wrote home that the British were in no political nor military situation to fight the Bourbons, and that the North government was very much keen not to add to its enemies in a time of crisis. A full-scale attack on the Bourbon empires would have necessitated a full mobilization of the Royal Navy, not just the 16 ships already mobilized, with all the costs and political will to bear it. At the same time, the Spanish foreign minister Grimaldi wrote to the ambassador, the Conde de Aranda, that there was no reason to fear a British attack at the current moment and that Spain had only taken the standard precautionary measures to protect her own empire, further evidence that Vergennes' agenda was something entirely different. Vergennes' initiative was supported by Sartine, who saw the escalation with Britain as a way to increase the importance of his own department. The duplicity of both men can be further seen in the orders Sartine gave out to France's major ports after the meeting. Long-term overhauls to the dockyards were ordered, further suggesting that Vergennes' claim of an imminent attack on the French Empire was indeed not genuine. Ships also started to be fitted out for arms shipments instead of battle. 3 weeks were given for all members of the council to reply to the considerations. Vergennes knew very well that limited support could be sent to America for a time, as the Lord North government was extremely unwilling to add to its enemies. Yet it is hard to believe that Vergennes did not know the long-term risks of such a policy. It may also be puzzling how such an intelligent and diligent man of peace as Vergennes could pursue an agenda pandering to the entrenched elite resisting reform and disgruntled army officers craving another war for their own advancement and glory. The answer can be found in Vergennes' underlying principles that guided his diplomacy. As mentioned before, he believed only a true balance of power in Europe could guarantee the safety of his monarch's possessions. He believed that the last war had created an imbalance of power by the total victory of Britain. Hence, he thought, only by reducing Britain's power and by showing other powers that France was still a force to be reckoned with could his monarch's possessions be secure. He also believed only if Britain was reduced to size could France be seen by her as an equal and both powers could cooperate to secure a lasting peace in Europe. He then could mimic his great idol, the Cardinal de Fleury, who presided over a golden age in French diplomacy and who also cooperated with Britain. This paradox in his agenda to most modern listeners may be perceived as insane, however it made sense in Vergennes' world. He was a man of the Enlightenment and believed in the cold pragmatism of the diplomacy of absolutist 18th century courts. In England, however, the government was voted into office by Parliament and Parliament depended on public opinion, not on the cold pragmatism of enlightened diplomats. Public opinion in France was also on the side of Vergennes in the 3 weeks leading up to the second meeting. Nobles and craftsmen were disgruntled by Turgot's reform and anti-Turgot rhetoric was heating up. This emboldened Vergennes to go even further. His next memoir, drafted by his brilliant assistant, the Marquis de Naval, as well as the ones of Sartine and Maurepas, were now more forthright. These so-called reflections did not present the American war as a danger to be avoided, but as an opportunity France had no choice but to seize. It rationalized the intervention with referring to a supposed natural animosity between the two countries and by alluding to the possibility of seizing more ports in Newfoundland as well as securing a share of the American trade. The main argument, however, centered on the possibility of depriving Britain of her monopoly on the American trade. A monopoly on which Britain supposedly depended and thus depriving her of it should righten the balance of power. The memoir also maintained that the strength of the Royal Navy relied on American resources. Each of these points were accepted as a dogma of the mercantilism of Vergennes' day, yet they couldn't have been further from the truth. The supposed monopoly on trade with America did not actually exist to the extent Vergennes believed it did. Smuggling was rampant and the crackdown on smuggling of Dutch tea was one of the major causes for the Boston Tea Party. British trade with America was below 18% of her total trade, and American clients being served by British manufacturers were notoriously unreliable. This, although a significant number, was hardly a dependency. Defenders of the American colonists in Parliament tended to overstate this number. The Royal Navy also only got a fraction of her supplies, and only 10,000 out of 75,000 sailors from America. The most useful aspect of the colonies for the Navy were the bases they provided, sheltering her ships from hurricanes in hurricane season. American forces could also be used for operations in the Western Hemisphere, making America's military usefulness perhaps the most important of those points. Turgot, at the same time, handed on his own reflections. He argued that there was no serious threat from Great Britain at the current moment, and even if one should arise later, French colonies' benefits did not outweigh the costs of defending them, let alone fight a major war over them. He correctly stated that France's ramshackle tax system was not efficient enough to support a big war. Instead, he argued France should focus her attention at the increasing of the tax base and rationalizing the tax system. France had a bigger population than Britain anyways, and would be the stronger power in the long term. He went on, however, to undercut his own argument by conceding that France should prepare for a possible war with Britain. He also argued a British victory would weaken the British Empire more than a defeat. A forcefully held America would be massively expensive for Britain to maintain. He also attacked the argument of British economic dependency on America, but conceded on certain points, undercutting his own position again. Within a few days of the presentation of the memoirs, the king's confidence in Turgot had begun to disintegrate due to a campaign of innuendo and private accusations orchestrated by Maurepas. Anonymous pamphlets began circulating, ridiculing the minister and spreading mockery at court, for example about Turgot's austere way of life and his pedantic Enlightenment spirit. The elites of France, just having lost lucrative monopolies or tolling privileges, as well as the protection of high tariffs, made Turgot responsible for a food shortage that swept France in 1775, caused by a bad harvest. Maurepas professed to the king that Turgot was a dangerous lunatic who caused the people of France to oppose their king. Always too weak to resist pressure and prone to manipulation, Louis ousted his brilliant minister on the 12th of May 1776. The stage was cleared for Vergennes to effectively rule France for the duration of the war in a triumvirate together with Maurepas and Sartine. This new government of France, although having great cohesion in directing the war effort for the years to come, presided over the ruining of the monarchy's finances to a point of no return. In the end, Turgot, long after his death, would win the argument, and his dream of a more modern France would come true 13 years later. This is the first part of a documentary series detailing how the French Navy waged war on the Royal Navy in the War of American Independence and how it helped birth a new country in the process. I hope you enjoyed this detailed introduction into the topic. Let me know in the comments if you would like to see extensive context videos like these in the future. If you want to follow along with this epic story of fierce struggle over the oceans in the next episodes of this series, feel free to subscribe and activate the bell button not to miss it. In this series, if it is well received by you, my dear viewer, we shall cover iconic battles such as the Moonlight Battle, Battle of Chesapeake Bay, and the iconic Battle of the Saints. Again, like last time, feel free to leave criticism and suggestions in the comments below. If you want to support this channel and help me clear my schedule in order to make more videos like these, feel free to support me on Patreon. With that said, I shall give you my goodbyes and au revoir.